Hello and welcome back once more to the channel where we skip an album in our sequence because the last video took way too long to make. Today I will be talking about the fourth 10cc album and the final album of the era in question. In a lot of ways this is my favorite 10cc album. In the very unlikely event of somebody accosting me and with the threat of violence compelling me to tell them my favorite 10cc album, I don't think I would even have to think about it. I think I would just say this one. But at the same time, it's not quite as simple as that. You know, there's something going on here that is very different. Something very different that's happening here even from the last album, never mind the first two. So a big thing to know about 10cc as they went along is that they streamlined a lot. By this point, by the sessions for this album, there was starting to be creative disagreements within the band, and in particular, Kevin Godley and Lol Creme were starting to feel that the material that Eric Stewart and Graham Goldman were bringing to the table was, it was sort of commercial. It was not really up to the artistic levels that, they were looking for. Which, there's something that I realized when I was, doing my research for this project and for a couple of other projects I'm going to be working on later in the year, that a lot of the people who I talk about on this channel, a lot of the artists I review, tend to be sort of creatively relatively high-strung people. And what the breakdown of 10cc during the sessions for this album, and especially during the sessions for the next album, which wound up just being a Goldman-Stewart affair, seemed like an example of this because, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here, but Deceptive Benz is an album that most people would kill to have made. But, in 1976, 1977, for Godley and Creme, it wasn't cutting it anymore, and there's a sense of, genuine dissatisfaction. And so after this album, they wind up leaving 10cc and making Consequences, which is the album I'm going to talk about right after this one. And Consequences we'll get to that. And that's the fascinating thing about this album to me, is that when you know the history, when you've heard the albums in sequence, both the 10cc albums up to this point, and then the 10cc albums after this, and the Godley and Creme albums after this, and you carry that into listening to this album again. Once you have all of that, and you listen to this album, you hear it. It's clear as day that the group are pulling in two entirely separate directions, Goldman and Stewart are moving in a direction of sort of really well done, well written, really good sort of mid-70s Beatlesy commercial rock. And Godley and Creme are going just off the wall, out there, we're gonna be weird. But because 10cc are still a pop band in a way that Consequences is absolutely not, it's mitigated to a certain extent. This is where I realized that I am now 3 videos deep into a 10cc series and I have not explained what a gizmotron is yet, which I am going to do now because it will save us maybe 5 minutes of what will probably already be like a 30 or 35 minute video next time. Basically, the gizmotron was a machine that was devised by Godley and Creme in the very late 60s and early 70s. It would attach to a guitar, and it had little rotating rubber wheels that you could depress onto the strings. And it was a way to emulate strings on the sound. You could sort of do some synthy noises with it too, and on Consequences, they went crazy with it. They tried to, they were emulating instruments, all over the place. Instruments they had absolutely no business emulating with a gizmotron. But nonetheless, it's very interesting. It has a very unique and interesting sound that I would describe as... The best way I could sort of describe the sound is that it's less uncanny than a mellotron, but not as good as a real string. The thing is that, they were eventually mass produced in the late 70s. Consequences was supposed to be a trial record for the Gizmotron in a lot of ways, but unfortunately, the quality was not good. There were issues. There were issues with the rubber wheels. Musicians really liked them. They were used most notably and famously by Led Zeppelin on In the Evening, I believe in the intro to In the Evening. But, they were very short-lived, and there's kind of an idea that's time had already come and gone by the time they were in production. Like, if Gizmotrons had started being made in, like, the late 50s, I could see maybe they would have had some legs, but, synthesizers, the next generation of synthesizers were right around the corner in the late 70s, and, recently a company has started making them again, and you can buy them. I actually tried to talk my thumbnail artist into getting one, so he could make Mexican Gizmotron-inspired alternative rock, but, and I made him listen to Consequences, and I'm pretty sure he vetoed that idea entirely out of spite. But anyway, I'm rambling here, so let's talk about the tracks. So we open the album with the instrumental title track. This track is a thrilling instrumental. It reminds me a bit of library music and sort of trendy film scores from the mid to late 60s, especially that second part when it really gets going. There's Gizmotron throughout, some of the most efficient and natural use of the instrument in the entire time that 10cc used it. To the point that for the longest time, I didn't even know it was Gizmotron on here. It just sounds like 70s strings, the way they recorded strings in the mid to late 70s. It has that sound, but no, it's the Gizmotron. It's not something I turn on a lot in isolation, but it's a really singular way to open up this album. And it's a ballsy move to open your album with an instrumental when you're not primarily an instrumental band. It would be kind of like if the Beatles had opened Magical Mystery Tour with Flying. This track I enjoy quite a bit. It has a cool melody, a kind of laid-back atmosphere, some really nice production. It also has a really cool prelude at the very end of the last track that I forgot to mention about. So a fun little story about myself. When I was first driving independently back when I was in high school, my brother came up with a very technical term that I have used for music ever since. And it refers to music that is not especially palatable, as it were, for the general public, and that would merit the response of my brother, the titular phrase that refers to this kind of music: what is this music? I mention this because I Want to Rule the World is like peak what is this music. This is like some of the most what is this music outside of the discography of Captain Beefheart or Frank Zappa. It is pretty categorically the weirdest thing that made it onto a 10cc album in the 70s. Especially the weird sort of megalomaniac theater whatever stuff in the middle. And the weird high-pitched falsetto voices saying, talking about how when he falls, he'll rise in Latin. I do like it, especially the catchy bit that pops up with that guitar and the organ, and the backing vocals about, what you're gonna do, how you're gonna do it. I enjoy that, but it's weird. I'm Mandy Fly Me is a phenomenal track. This album's hit. It got to the top 10 in the UK, 60 in the US, not quite as respectable, but at least it was there. The story of how it was written is very similar to the story of 10cc's other huge hit from around this period, and indeed the song that they are internationally most remembered for, I'm Not in Love, which is a song I didn't talk about chronologically because I had to skip the last album, although I will go back and talk about it relatively soon. Basically, Goldman and Stewart had written a good, nice, light pop song that they scrapped because they didn't like. Then Kevin Godley pointed out a way that it could be improved. In this case, what was done to the song is perhaps not quite as drastic as I'm Not in Love, and the track is very much in the same key as some of the more intricate songwriting of the earth on the first two albums, although not quite as busy. It's closer to the thing McCartney does sometimes, where the middle eight is almost just a completely different song. For a really good example of this in his solo career, that is probably not the example most people would reach for, but it's the one I'm going for. Listen to The Pound is Sinking off of his album Tug of War. Anyway, like I said, this track is incredible stuff. One of my favorite pop songs of the 70s. When I bought this album, which was originally on vinyl for I think like $3 or $4, this was the track that really pulled me in. This was the track that got me spinning that LP time and time again, and eventually impelled me to acquire other formats of the album as well. Iceberg is, well, it's kind of a song of two halves. On the one hand, you have the music, which is excellent. It's a sort of jaunty, jazzy thing with a slight 40s influence, perhaps apparent in some of the chords and some of the chorus stuff, backing vocals, etc. Nothing like as extreme as the Roy Wood album I reviewed not too long ago, but it does remind me a little bit of that type of thing Roy Wood was doing on Mustard. That little hint of jazziness in the guitars. And in that level, it's wonderful. It's very catchy. The opening bits, the life is a roller coaster that we all ride, the vocal stuff, the melodies, it's all excellent, but the subject matter. According to Graham Goldman, who co-wrote the song with Kevin Godley, this is a song about a schizophrenic. And perhaps that is the case. But when I listen to the lyrics for this song, I don't hear a song about a schizophrenic. I hear a song about how shall I put this in a way that YouTube will not demonetize me on the spot. This is a song about a sexual predator. In fact, I think that's very well illustrated by the presence on the back cover of the album, tying in with the overall, hypnosis, I don't know, cover that was done for this album. Probably one of their best covers. This and the next 10cc album. But anyway, if you see the somewhat disreputable character in the phone booth calling up the flight attendant for my Mandy Fly Me, you get the picture. It's and once you've realized that, it's actually, it's kind of a sickening song. I said in my sheet music video that was maybe the most problematic 10cc album from a modern viewpoint, and I think that maybe the diciest moment in 10cc's whole career, I would say we're about 4 albums out from talking about, which in the terms of the actual 10cc discography means we're about 2 albums out, but when you add the Godley and Cream and finishing up my other projects, I think that song I'm not going to mention directly by name until we get to it is probably actually like the diciest song in the 10cc discography. But I don't think you could write a song like this today. And I think, but of course, like I said, it's got that great music. It's got those great hooks. The vocals are excellent. On the other hand, it's a song about a sexual predator. Opening side 2, Art for Art's Sake, is another very strong track. 6 minutes in the album cut, I think about 3 and some change in the single. Which by the way got to number 5, actually higher than I'm Mandy Fly Me, sort of nullifying what I was saying before, and also, really showing you where the rock charts were in 1976. It's an interesting track, kind of a bitter, slightly funky, almost dirge-like track, The lyrics are apparently inspired by something Graham Goldman's father used to say, and I get the tone of sort of bitterness and cynicism about the industry and, art in general, which is interesting because that doesn't really quite fit the tone of where they'd go afterwards, but in most other respects, this song stands out to me in that it very easily could have been on the next 10cc album, which, as I said, is a trend here. You listen to this album in isolation, and you think, oh, it's a great 10cc album. But you listen to it with the knowledge of their whole discography and, you know, the personal rivalries and everything that was happening in the band. And it's clear as day. Like I said, you know, the Godley and Cream stuff we've talked about so far sounds like Consequences. And this, which is a Goldman Stewart song, sounds in basically all respects other than the lyrics like something that could have been on Deceptive Bends. That being said, I do really love this track. I think the sort of bitter edge is something I wish they could have carried a little bit more into their later stuff after Godley and Cream left, you know, and the instrumentation is just really cool. Especially the percussion and the overall sort of studio effects and production of the track. Rock and Roll Lullaby is another Stuart Goldman track. You know, another one reminds me a lot of stuff that's on Deceptive Bends. You know, in particular, Marriage Bureau Rendezvous, and maybe just a little bit of About a Flat Guitar Tutor. You know, it's that style of thing that they do, and it's one of the last really great kind of glammy 10cc tracks. You know, it threads this line between the overdriven guitar thing and the kind of cutesy, vaguely doo-wop. It's a funny track because it's one that if I'm picking and choosing from this album, I'll never listen to it. In fact, you know, when I'm picking and choosing, I generally think of this as being maybe the worst track on the album. But, you know, when I really let it play and I listen to it, I think it's pretty good. Headroom is a lot like Iceberg in that it is a song of two parts. Musically, I really enjoy it. You know, vocally, I really enjoy it. It has this cool, you know, sort of guitar-driven, slightly jazzy, but also not necessarily thing happening in it, and the changes are changes that I happen to enjoy quite a bit. But the lyrics, they remind me of like late career Andy Partridge. They're trying to be cheeky, you know, a little bit of innuendo for the lads, you know, and it just I don't like it, you know, because it's trying to be cutesy about well, you know, there's a way to do that, and I don't necessarily think that being cutesy about it is the way to do it. It's basically the same problem I have with Pink Thing by XTC, to provide a specific example of what I'm thinking of. But again, like I said with Iceberg, outside of the lyrics, most specifically the lyrics of the chorus, absolutely like middle school level humor. It's a really fun song. And so we end the album with perhaps my favorite track on the entire album, Don't Hang Up. A 6-minute and 15-second track about divorce. And it feels almost like, this feels like the negative version of something like Somewhere in Hollywood or Sand in My Face, in that, you know, it is immaculately written. You know, the chorus melody, you know, the middle eight, which in and of itself is like, has like two different movements, and I think is overall the best part of this song. You know, it's just an incredible track, and it really, really points forward thematically, both to where the band was going and where Godley and Cream themselves were going, and the sort of subject matter of half of Consequences. It is an extremely strong track. But as I said, what stands out to me is that it is so negative. It's all of the motion, all of the tricks and techniques of 10cc on these first 4 albums, but it's very dark. There's a little bit of comedy on this track, but it really doesn't come off as comedy in practice. And which I think works in a way that, if I lay some of my cards on the table for what's coming out in the next like 5 days, is part of my problem with Consequences, is that Consequences has moments of just incredible darkness. Like, Funeral Scene is one of the grimmest things on record in the 70s. Then it'll careen wildly into just like absolute pure and total slapstick. Just absolute pure and total comedy that, you know, there's no way you could ever take this seriously in a million years. And for me, you know, maybe it's an indication of, you know, me having a morbid nature, which, you know, is probably not wrong. I think I prefer this track. I think I prefer the approach that you find on this track. And not by no means this entire album, but specifically on this track, which, you know, easily a top 5 10cc cut for me. And an incredible way to end the last album they ever did with Godley and Creme as full participating members who co-wrote most of the songs. As you may have guessed from those track reviews, I am extremely fond of How Dare You. In fact, as I said in the intro, on most days, this is my favorite 10cc album. And for me, it really comes down to the fact that I think this is the one that has it all. It has the goofiness, intricate songwriting. It has the darkness that crept into 10cc as they went along and that is very much in effect on those first couple Godley and Creme albums. And all in all, even though, as I keep saying in this video, if you know the history of this group, if you know the personalities of the band members and their songwriting styles, you can hear just as plainly as anything, they're very much pulling apart on this album. Despite all of that, I think, for me at least, this is the one. This is my favorite. This honestly might be my favorite album of 1976. It's always such a hard call to make, especially for me because I am horrifically indecisive. And usually like a week after I've made a list, I've completely changed my mind about almost everything on it. But honestly, I might stand by that. I think this might be my favorite album of 1976. Returning to my original point, there's a blend here that neither of the two camps the band divided into ever quite recaptured again, you know. There's Godley and Creme stuff after they left 10cc that is just genuinely phenomenal and singular and absolutely deserves to be put up there with the best 10cc. And there's also post Godley and Creme 10cc that is right up there with the best work they did. I've mentioned several times throughout this video, and I will mention it in much greater detail at some future point in time, that Deceptive Bends is an album that in many respects I think is just as good as the first four. But in both cases, there's something for me, personally at least, that is missing, that is very much present on those first four albums. And as wonderful as all of those solo works are, for me at least, it's never quite this good again. You know, this album, and really the first four in general, are just some of the most magical and singular albums released in the 70s. They're albums that they have their warts, they've dated a little bit, and they're definitely not for somebody who prizes nothing but originality and only originality. You know, for as much as I love 10cc, they are absolutely categorically one of those 70s art rock bands where their entire discography exists in the shadow of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And maybe a little bit of what Frank Zappa and the Bonzo Dog Band were doing around that time, but for the most part, it's all Sgt. Pepper era Beatles. You know, I forgot where that sentence was going, but anyway, unless you're one of those people, I cannot recommend these first four 10cc albums highly enough. And the fifth album and the first three Godley and Creme albums, but you know, that's a story for another day, and that day is coming very soon, because I have absolutely no sense of pacing, and you know, and as soon as I stop recording this, I will immediately start recording the next video in the series, which will come out very, very, very soon. But until then, you all have a wonderful day.